thank you. And Mariano Rupertuz, who you're not going to see, is our technical person in the background helping us. Thank you, Mariano. So I wanted to welcome all of you to the IPA Journal Club featuring Dr. Beverly J. Stoute from Atlanta. I'm in New York. I'm Jack Drescher. I'm a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. Next slide. I'm a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst in New York City, and the moderator of the Journal Club. And if you mark your calendars, March 8th, I think, is our next Journal Club. I'll show a slide at the end of this one. Our guest today is Beverly Stoute. Dr. Stoute has, as you can see, has a very distinguished bio. She's a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist and analyst, an executive coach and organizational consultant, and is co-chairs of the American Psychoanalytic Association's Holmes Commission. She's a training and supervising analyst at Emory University and a child and adolescent supervising analyst at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, where I know she did her training, and an adjunct professor at Emory. And on and on and on and on and on she goes. So, you know, you can read her bio at the website as well. So talk a little bit about how the Journal Club is going to be conducted. Next slide. So the idea of a journal club in medicine, not all of you come from a medical background, who have journal clubs where people, a senior person would read a paper with the residents and teach them how to read a paper. But when we came up with the idea, we said, well, since we now have Zoom, we can not only read a paper, but we can also invite the author of the paper to actually respond to your questions. So our hope today is that for those of you who have read the paper, and I hope you have read the paper, it's a great paper, that you'll be able to talk. The session is being recorded because it will be up both on the webpage of the International Psychoanalytic Association, as well as the IPA's YouTube channel. And in fact, if you're interested, this is our fourth journal club since last June, and the other three journal clubs are both archived on the IPA website as well as on YouTube. Now, since we want this to be interactive, you know, if you don't wish to be recorded, have your face seen, please leave your camera off. But since we want it to be interactive, I may not call on you if you don't want to be seen, because we would like the questioners to interact directly with Dr. Stoute. Next slide. If you have questions, we're not using the chat function for questions. We're not using the hand raise function. We are using the Q&A section. So feel free to put your comments in the Q&A section. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see an icon that says Q&A. It has like two talk balloons on top of Q&A. Please stay muted throughout the conference until you're called on. And the next slide. Okay, so when you're called upon, and based on your comment or question in the Q&A, please unmute yourself, turn on your video camera if it's not already turned on. When you are called upon, you can please say your name, tell us where you're from. We've had a very interesting international appearance naturally. And also try and speak slowly and clearly, because not everybody who is tuned in here is a native English speaker. And of course, if you haven't downloaded the papers yet, please feel free to do so. The paper is still, Mariano, if you could put the link to download the paper in the chat, that would be great for people if they haven't downloaded it already. And the next slide is, I think this is the last of our, next slide. Okay, all right, so we can turn off the slides. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. For those of you who arrived late, I'm Jack Drescher. I'm going to introduce Dr. Stoute. I'm going to ask the first question to get things started. But please, if you have questions already based on what you've read in the paper, feel free to put it in the chat, and I will call on you in the order in which I receive the questions. Thank you very much. So let me get my first question. Hi, Beverly.
Let me unmute myself. Good morning, Jack, and good morning, everyone.
Hi. So welcome. And so my first question is, how did you decide to write this paper, and what was it like getting the paper published?
Well, so I'd like to begin, and anyone who's heard me speak, is to rewind, to position us in terms of history. I never know exactly how I'm going to start until I feel the moment of the day. So James Baldwin said, history is not the past. It is the present. We carry our history in us. We are our history. So I start there because that's what I'm feeling in this moment. When I speak often, I also start off with a land acknowledgement. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and I stand on the territory of the Muskogee people, all of whom were violently displaced because of European colonialism 400 years ago. And I start off by paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. And I keep in mind, given that I'm in Georgia, that the land and county where I am, there were 4 lynchings from 1887 to 1945. I think that all of us have shared cultural histories of historical trauma. I pause for a moment because I think we're all currently being impacted by that in with the Israeli and Palestinian people now. So I pause for a moment to reflect. So in my Black Rage paper, I referred to Winnicott, who said there are ad raids going on, and everyone kept going. And in the pandemic, what we learned is that psychoanalytic theory positioned us separate from our culture and our history. And when I wrote this paper, I wanted to give some voice to the fact that I think that occurred because of Freud's own conflict with his own cultural trauma. And perhaps it took our history together to move forward to be able to give voice to that. I personally have the point of view that when the field of psychoanalysis was diversified, which I talk about the history in my book, which I researched back in the literature, that early conceptualizations about racism centered on anti-Semitism, but I do think that even then, the issue of rage, trauma, and destructiveness were minimized. But I think that was culturally understandable, given that the early founding of our field were centered on analysts who came here escaping Nazism. So I think it's a natural evolution that we now can position ourselves and open up the conversation. And I think people of color, especially African Americans in the United States, have a unique flair to their history, which I can talk about and gave me some inspiration during the pandemic to write the paper. But I think we all have shared cultural histories of trauma. I believe I could take this paper with each participant and bring up the history of where you sit and create a version of what rage is about. So in my mind, rage is a universal. The specific cultural representation in Black rage, which we can talk about, I think while it comes from a specific history in the United States, I think all of us have a history that is representative. So when I wrote the paper, if we can think back, and I don't know if it is easy to think back to where we were in 2020. We were a group of us were asked to give a panel for the June 2020 meeting. And we started thinking about that around in March and April. So it was right when the pandemic was erupting. And I had written a paper on pandemics and it seemed kind of lackluster and I didn't really like it. And then one day, now I went back in my iPhone to find this picture and I had some better ones, but somehow I think they got sent to my iCloud and I'm not so good at finding them. But I'm going to show this picture because it was where my mind was when I tore up the paper I was written. I said, how do I give voice to that? So bear with me in my technological skill or lack thereof. So I was sitting in front of the TV and I took this picture with my iPhone. And there were several others where I realized, and I still look at it, it moves me across the world. People were demonstrating. And how do I get out of that, Jack?
You're out.
Okay. And I thought, if you look at those crowds, it's all of us. How do I give voice to that? How do I give voice to there's something that gets stirred when any of us are robbed of dignity, representation, inclusion, equality, human compassion, and the way that our government works. And the Black Lives Matter movement stirred something. And that video in the technological world stirred, and the one picture in the paper, if you saw the electronic version, you were fortunate enough to see the picture in color. When it was reprinted in my book, they did it in black and white, and it's just not the same. That stirred something across the world. And that's when I just sat down and wrote what I felt about that experience. And also, the history that for me is, we can talk about when our rage becomes destructiveness, but why don't we ever talk about when we hold our rage back and try to funnel it towards something? So the Black Lives Matter movement, part of it tries to represent the cultural history of the civil rights movement and demonstrations in American history. So we try to have demonstrations to show when we feel that there has been injustice. And at the core of that is a moral injury of what injustice does to any one of us. And that should trigger compassion in all of us, because we all have histories in which injustice is represented. But in that moment in the world, across the world, we shared it briefly. How do we talk? Why don't we talk about that? And now psychoanalytic theory has to contend with the fact that that actually intrapsychically is represented. And this generation of children, I believe, who grew up with almost 3 years of their lives in a pandemic, it will irrevocably affect their development, and it is internalized in a way that impacts their intrapsychic world. And how do we give voice to that? So, long answer to your short question, Jack, is it was it was a moment to say, how do we say, what is that? Now we can talk about what that is, but it is an experience that I started off as a culturally specific example that I believe has universal representation. But universal representation, in the way that I think about it psychoanalytically, is a pluralistic way of taking into account the unique cultural representations, not erasing them, because I don't truly believe, especially from my personal position as a person of color, the social always matter in the way that I think, and it has impacted my development. So how do we develop a theory that takes it into account rather than, excises pieces?
But let me say, so if one of the things I hear you saying is that the kind of trauma that produces rage could be considered universal, but there are individual differences in the way different cultures respond to the trauma. That is, you can universalize certain aspects of the trauma experience, but then when you get to the individual from a cultural perspective, then how does that get fed into their development and their intrapsychic development and both their intrapsychic development and their interpersonal development? Would that be a fair statement?
Yes. And that might be loaded because I'm a child analyst. Because so each person who comes into my office brings a whole collective with them. I always say, in order for me to have a child analysis, I have to sit down and put together everyone's schedule to make it possible for that one person to be in my office. And if in a little snapshot, if towards the end of the paper, when I talk about Panskeep and some of the new biological ideas, they clearly say that while we have biological propensities to rage, and the argument now is that rage is a drive, maternal interaction, cultural representation, history, influence, how that is represented in one's life, and developmental experience. So yes, I think all of that is integrated into the development of the individual in the culture.
We have an anonymous participant who wants to know how Black rage differs from more generic activist rage.
So I think activist rage is a root of Black rage. The reason I called it Black rage, and I had a long discussion, let's say, and with the editors around getting to say capital B, capital R, because capital B, capital R is not the same as little b, little r. And capital R rage is a conceptualization that I think is different from little r rage, which is more of an affect. So inherent in the concept of Black rage to me, and why I position it as connected to Greer and Cobb's early book, An African American History, is that it was a historical perspective in which, from slavery through Jim Crow to the Civil Rights Movement, it was a survival mechanism and necessary to manage rage. Rage can become destructive, or rage can be mobilized. I see a good deal of activism and the civil rights movement as mobilizing it in a positive way. So in the course of history, we know from many, many different works that we carry these positions and histories transgenerationally. Volkan talks about how we carry the traumas of one generation to the next, even to the point of having our own fantasies that really are the fantasies of the generation that came before us. Maurice Apri talks about how history is inscribed in us. So history is not just a sequence of events, it is inscribed in us, and those sediments that he calls them are represented and reactivated for us. So the conflict in Black rage is, when rage is activated, how do we manage it? Little r. Now, little r can go on to become aggression, and then I believe sadistic destructiveness. And I believe that psychoanalytic theory can evolve more on its way of looking at sadism, because I think that in the history of African Americans, lynching was a sadistic cultural enactment that occurred in 44 of the 50 states, in which people of color were terrorized. But I also believe white identified people were terrorized because children were exposed to unbelievable acts of torture and sadistic violence. So how does a culture that believes in equality manage that? So during the course of African American history, one could not do certain things or one would be lynched. But one had to find a way of fighting and challenging that. And I believe the civil rights movement and also Gandhi's movement in nonviolence were representations of managing rage in a way that channels it to a positive aim. Martin Luther King said, not nonviolence, but nonviolent resistance. Nonviolent resistance means it's not that we don't have the rage and that we want to identify with the aggressor and destroy back. It's that we hold it. We have not just the rage of destructiveness, but it's grounded in a sense of moral injury of what is just and what respects the dignity of an individual or a group of people. If that is your guiding principle, then you hold back being destructive and you challenge it in some way. And if you're Gandhi and you say, nonviolent and represent love as a way of holding back, then that's a different way of thinking about it in a cultural way than allowing, for example, the representations in history that leads to violence. And it's funny because I didn't realize this until I went back. I pulled a book from my shelf the other day, and Erickson called in Erickson's biography of Gandhi, Gandhi's Truth, the subtitle is On the Origins of Militant Nonviolence. That is what, in my mind, Black rage is really about. And that cultural representation relates to the history. And the next paper that I've already written on this, I asked the question when I presented, how many Black people in the United States lynched white people? No one has ever said one. How did that happen? There are two scenes I show when I teach about this. One is the scene in the Malcolm X movie, I don't know if we have time for it, where they show up after a Black man has been killed, and hundreds of people want to storm the hospital. And a group of men, all Muslim, are standing there, impeccably dressed, calm, holding back the crowd. That is what Black rage means. And he says, we want to know what happened. The other scene, so it's not that you don't have the rage, is that how you hold it back. The other scene I show is from the movie about Gandhi in the Salt Works demonstration, where the leader says, Gangaji said, stand, but don't hit back. And it's a beautiful cinematographic scene where all of the Indians are dressed in white, and they walk up to the salt mine guards, and they're beaten down one by one. And this went on, if you know the history, I think almost that entire day. And they carried off, but they didn't in one moment hit back. That to me is the most beautiful representation of what it means to show nonviolent, militant nonviolence. And at the end of the scene, the reporter says, what moral ascendancy the West had that day fell. That to me is the pictorial representation of what it means. So activism is at the root of what Black rage is about. And it's an activism that says that we will represent the moral injury and the indignant rage in the injustice, but we have to get to a better end. And that better end is somehow to show loving restraint. And there are only a few examples in history where human beings have been able to do that. In that way, I think it is a universal, because I think anyone in this audience could tell me a history of violence. And anyone can tell me histories that I don't know of people who've held strong to principle. And in the mind, then, there must be a way of representing how that gets managed. And that's what the theoretical proposal of a Black rage construct is, that transgenerationally we carry the history, the mental representations, what Bordeaux, the sociologist, calls the inclinations to act in a certain way to certain outgroups in the society. And we carry it in our mind, and there must be an ego function in my mind, which is my next extension, that helps us begin to manage how that rage is represented. So I hope that gets, to your question. Activism in my mind is a demonstration for justice and dignity in the face of injustice, but it is not in the order of being destructive. It is an elevating, how do we move forward?
Beverly, thank you. We have some questions. There's a comment from Gordon Yakshin. I'm sorry, I can't, I don't know if I mispronounced. Can you hear me? Yeah, so Gordon writes, as an older white male living in Canada, thank you for your important paper that helps me to learn about and understand Black rage. And then we have Varun Goel, who would like to ask a question. Could you unmute yourself and turn?
I appreciate live questions. Thank you.
Yes, we're gonna get a live question. Okay. So Varun, could you unmute yourself and show yourself and speak up?
Yes. Yes. Can you all see me?
No,
No, you have to turn your camera on.
Oh, my
yes.
says
There you go.
Oh, yes, yes. Now we see you. Oh, no, yes, I see everyone. This is wonderful.
okay, wonderful. Hi. And thank you so much to everyone who's involved in organizing this to create this kind of space.
Varun, excuse me, where are you? Just let us know where you
Yes,
are.
please.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm in New York City. I'm a third-year psychiatry resident at Cornell in Manhattan, and of course, very interested in analysis. I think uh, there's a lot of room for using analysis as a route to really acknowledge the full complexity of people, and that to me is really inspiring. I think when we're talking about issues of equity and oppression, I'm interested in thinking about this idea of Black rage and sort of where the intrapsychic constructs can be influenced externally as well. And one of the tensions that I have around the pure expression of militant nonviolence and the sort of relationship that can have with martyrdom in some ways. The question of the reality that in our society, as a global society, we have these sort of objects of power that exist now in various forms that to me sort of feel like they can take the place of like an intrapsychic rage, almost like they're almost like containers for that rage when power dynamics are shifted in one way or the other. And so it feels that when I think about this from the context of power dynamics and what populations have power, which populations don't have power, globally speaking, that it feels important to me then to discuss, well, what is it about the rage that's sort of like affectively charged in a way that that it can be very divisive for folks? What is it about that function that's replacing a lack of having an object of power that can, literally be used to silence someone or end someone's life? And I find that sort of dichotomy difficult to reconcile in some ways. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how to sort of think about the different manifestations of rage and who has access, right? There's privilege, I think, involved with accessing certain types of rage and enacting that in certain ways. Yeah, so I know I'm meandering a bit, but
Well,
gives you a general.
I think we could have a meeting just around your question. So first, I have to tell you, I did my residency at Cornell, so it's so wonderful to see you. Okay. Complicated question, and I have an example. When I read the people said, Beverly, I don't get it. Are there clinical examples of this? And I said, well, if you're asking me that question, then you've been in the presence of rage and not realized it. I have to say, one of the reasons I wrote the paper also, Jack, and you and I had this conversation about metapsychology, as I believe, at least, if there isn't a place to understand rage and have space for the rage, especially when you are working with people of marginalized identity, then there will never be a place in psychoanalytic community where we are truly equitable. Because the rage that gets carried forth in generations for marginalized people outside of the power dynamic continues and doesn't die. And in order to, as analysts, understand it, one must make space for it and understand what is it representing in that person, but what is it triggering in me? Because after all, I have my own history. Now, if we pretend that we're a dyad with no history, then it never gets considered. But if we pretend that not only does the analysand have a history, but I too, as the analyst, have one. Freud Dazal, who's a wonderful speaker, in one of his papers that I used to teach, says, at any one point in time, we are all similar and we are all different. It is a defensive process which one you choose. And when power, to your question, gets infused, then really that makes it complicated. But if we pretend that that's not part of the situation, then we lose a huge amount of information that we could learn. And so I think we've had opportunities in the analytic world to analyze power dynamics, the dynamics of marginalization, of oppression, of the way in which privilege disconnects us. Oh, something's wrong with my my power button here. That we could have used towards a better end. Now, why is my computer telling me that the power is low when the plug is in? There's something strange going on here with my, oh wow, with the power. I might have to change computers. I don't know what's happening here, Jack. Does it have to do with a power surge? Maybe we had a tornado watch here. So I don't know if I had a power surge, but for some reason my computer is not charging and it's plugged in. I apologize. Give me 1 second because this is distracting me from knowing why it says. I'm going to have to sign on with another computer. It's all plugged in, but it's not, it's saying that the power is going to go out. So I'll also give you an example to represent this. And as I'm talking, I'm going to sign in with my other computer, which is charged, because I don't understand why. I don't understand why it's saying that.
Okay.
So we're only as analysts, we're only as good as our technology these days. I think also what happens is how our histories are activated concurrently, right? That's part of your question. Here we go, join meeting, open Zoom. And maybe our tech expert will see me come in under another computer.
We'll let you in.
Yeah, and I will sign off one and switch over. Allow. Okay. Okay, quick moment of switcheroo, but you'll continue to hear me while I switch.
Okay.
So I'll give you an example that will take 2 or 3 minutes, but I think it's a helpful example in what you're talking about. Now, the other me is the other me here?
I've admitted you.
Got it?
You should be in.
Okay, so
But turn on your camera.
got it.
On
Computer
other
audio.
you.
Okay. And
And
unmute.
Right.
Earbuds. Let me switch earbuds.
Okay.
I don't know why my camera's not. Jack, would you send me a
There you go. Can you hear? Can you hear us? Hi. Can you hear us, Beverly? Hello?
Jack, can you hear me?
I hear you. Do you hear me? Hello, Beverly?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't see. Am I here?
Yes. Yes, you're here.
Okay, I don't see. Okay.
Put yourself on speaker view or gallery view. You there?
Yep.
Shut off the other one.
Okay. Okay. Am I here only one time now?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. You're on. You're on.
Okay. Let me turn on the light and then talk. So let me give you one example of why I think this gets tricky. This is a 2-minute example. It's in my book, and it was an example written by my
my co-author about a brief interaction in the emergency room with a Black patient. It says, race can unsettle us. I'm sorry if the light is not good here. So, okay. And throw up roadblocks to listening and being heard. So how I'm heard by my patient may be very different from how I imagine myself to be speaking. Early in my career, an African-American patient who was homeless would come in frequently. She could, and my co-author is white, identified, okay. She could afford housing. She had a disability income that she husbanded throughout the month, but she was very particular. She repeatedly rejected housing possibilities offered by the nonprofit organization because they did not meet her standards. So she'd come to the ER, say she was suicidal, get a meal, and have a night's sleep in a warm bed. And in the morning, then she would deny she was suicidal and leave. Frustrated at her for the waste of healthcare dollars, one evening I said to her as she lay on the stretcher, "Mrs. X, this is not a hotel." She spun around, lifted herself on her elbow and shouted, "You effing white overseer." Her furious, racially loaded insult in response to what I thought was a mild scold set me back on my heels, and I was stung, angry, unsure how to respond. Her reminder of the trauma of slavery condensed into a symbol of her pain was flung like a weapon. And so we came to an understanding over time that she would not tell me she was suicidal, and I would say to her, "Would you like a meal before you leave?" It was a combination that gave us a balance of power, and each of us came to a deeper respect for the other. Yet when she showed up, I used at times to have a defense of bemused outrage with my colleagues over this. But then, and this is one of the aspects of what Michael learned in the course of our writing the book together, I know now there was a deep pain and personal history that drove my side of the accommodation. So to your point, first, in my mind, that's a micro moment of rage. We can respond and say, you can't speak to me that way. Or we can try to understand, what did it mean to that person in that moment that I, in the power representation of the system, said that to you, who I'm viewing in that remark as exploiting my system, which has already exploited you. Okay. Then the reason why it gets hard is because then the rage is stirred up. But what if the reason why that's difficult is because you have to reflect on why it's stirred up in you? And so this is what he came to understand in the course of this. It still moves me because it was a powerful experience of us writing this together. In the world of polarization, where we get with these conversations, when we wrote this book together, Michael and I, my book, The Trauma of Racism, we wrote together confronting each other, but with a powerful commitment to each other continuing together. In my mind, if love isn't at the base of assuaging the way rage can be destructive, and I mean human love in its finest hour, not in popular representations, then we don't really want it. So I was talking with some parents this morning, where their teenager has basically has trouble controlling his rage, which was made worse by the pandemic. And I said, he has to wanna. You have to wanna control what comes out. So what he learned was triggered in that moment was this. My mother's Texas roots were as much a part of my identity as the assimilated New York Jewish households my father had brought up in. But There were the stories my mother told, stories with a whitewashed subtext of race. At the outbreak of the Civil War, 4 brothers, and I'm a direct descendant of one, had gone to Sam Houston and asked, should we fight? He repeatedly says, I do not support this war, but I support my state. The brothers signed up and fought in the West for the Confederacy. It is a story of privilege and power and a dark and brutal reality I had avoided confronting for years. And he goes on to talk about discovering that members of his own family had fought for the South, for the Confederacy, for slavery, and how he had not even realized how much that was buried in him. But that moment with that patient, in a really uncanny way with her scold, triggered that. But where did that go for each of them? It only went to the place that he did because they were willing to sit in the rage, and he was willing to consider, what did it mean to her? And what did it mean to me? And how can we still have a relationship as we sit in that? That is the challenge of the moment, I believe.
Yeah, and you know, we have a couple more questions in the chat. Thank you, Varun, for your question. I hope that was a helpful response. But you're right. I mean, in a sense, how can we talk about anything that stirs up these personal histories, if you will, in a sense? You know, some people would like to say, well, these histories don't matter, or these histories took place so long ago that why are you bringing it up now? But I think your point is that, you know, that here's a young man who holds the history of having, you know, ancestors who fought for the Confederacy, you know, and is aware of it, and it has some meaning to him in the here and now. So, yeah, history is important.
But I argue that it's a here and now for all of us in ways we don't all know.
Yes.
And in the way that we're socialized not to be aware of what those histories represent. The larger question is, how can we have the conversations in a way that moves us forward?
Right.
Why don't our shared traumas bring us together instead of
Yeah.
fracturing our capacity for human? That's what racism in my mind is. It is separating off the ability to connect to another and the shared history by focusing on the need to keep them as other defensively.
Right. But, well, I would like to ask the next person who has a question to go in, but I would just say, in my own work, I talk about hierarchies of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons people do not want to talk about it, they only want to talk about it if you acknowledge that their suffering has been greater than yours. And that makes it difficult to have a conversation when people are competing about whose suffering was greater. But let me bring in another.
Let me say one thing to that, Jack, and that is,
okay.
It's sort of like when you have a conference and then you put the mic there for everybody to come up and speak.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody comes up to speak to tell their point. Why don't people, in order to get to a better place, we actually have to recognize each other's suffering and then talk. I would say this, I was raised as a Quaker. At a Quaker meeting, the goal isn't to make your point. The goal is, in the silence, to take in what the other person has given you and said first. Be moved by that person and then make your point. That's different. That's different from us just saying what our hierarchy was.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the part that we're not getting to. Recognition, cooperative recognition of each other's suffering. But the question that was raised by Varun is, in that is a power issue that we have to figure out how to understand as part of the conversation and acknowledge.
So our next question is from Nancy Drucker. Nancy, could you unmute yourself and turn your camera if it isn't already on? And you can ask your question to Beverly.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for this forum, and thank you for this paper, and for just all that you do and who you are. I'm very touched at how moved you are by when you speak. That's very moving to me. I was wondering about how you would describe what happens internally when there isn't a place or a way to express moral injury and rage. I'm thinking about children and who are sitting in a social surround or in a family in which there has been trauma inflicted on them, and that there is no way safely to express that. So it goes inside. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about how you understand that event process.
So again, another whole meeting. First of all,
Yes.
thank you for your kind.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind comment. You know, people. One person once said to me, "Why do you cry?" I'm not crying. I am moved.
Yes.
I'm moved by the power of what we can bring to each other, by the power of what we do every day. The moment we lose the capacity to be moved by the humanity of others, we lose who we are. And we succumb to the destructiveness that rage can lead us. It's a differential and that is important to me. And young clinicians always say, like, the fact that you do that makes us feel you can be authentic. Where people of color or marginalized identity in spaces don't always feel like they can be quote unquote authentic. That's the word people use these days, it's in vogue. And I like to represent that we can be that and be analysts too. I was classically trained at NIPSI, so I do believe in the restraint of what we do, but I believe we can be that and we can be humanly connected to others as well. I'm not sure why I'm seeing that.
I don't know. Hello, could Eileen turn off your screen sharing?
Okay.
Thank you.
And we can be analysts too. How do we do that? To your point, so there's a paper that I have written on the topic that you bring, which I interestingly was researching and wrote after the Black Rage paper on how our mind becomes racialized, on the data on racial ethnic socialization from children to adulthood and the differences in the way we end up. Because I think there are ways in which these conversations go south for people, and it's somewhat based on socialization about racial issues for people of color or marginalized identity and white identified people. I think it's like really a sexy idea that rage can be helpful, but there is a psychic cost. The increase in heart rate and rate of myocardial infarction in states of high structural racism, in my mind, is a representation of internalized rage. The higher infant mortality rate for Black children and Black mothers, regardless of wealth or socioeconomic status, I believe is carrying the allostatic road of rage and discrimination intrapsychically. I talk later in the next paper about how that can really connect to substance use, physiological hypertension, and other psychiatric symptoms like depression and anxiety, if there's no way to managing that. For children who are exposed to discriminating experiences developmentally, it does impact their psychic development. What also we do know is that there are ways that families help. And the other reason I wrote the paper is that the history of African Americans provides a social construct for understanding discrimination. And that begins with preparation from middle childhood into adolescence about what discrimination will now mean for your development. That does not go on. About 60 to 70%, depending on what study you look at, of white families in the United States rarely talk about race because race is not felt to be salient. What I believe that does is it means that people really aren't able to have conversations about what really race really means, aren't able to really understand how do we talk about racism in a society where it really is real, because the idea is we just teach that everybody's equal. Well, children are smart. They know you tell them that, but that's not their experience. We do know that mothers who have a solid sense of racial and ethnic identity, who teach their children about it, those kids have higher grades and higher self-esteem than kids who live in families who don't talk about it. So there are issues developmentally. I do think also that for children who are in that, the rage does turn into behavior problems and depression and anxiety. There was one study that showed that 92% of the African-American children in their study who were followed in the course of middle childhood, 7 or 8 through 10 into early adolescence, the ones who had, first of all, 5 or more discriminatory events per day in their adolescence, those who had behavior problems had a higher correlation with discriminatory experiences. We read those behavior problems as psychiatrically based. Maybe they're not. Maybe treatments that can recognize, and I saw this a lot during the pandemic with a couple of kids I had who lived near where the demonstrations were. Kids carry this in ways that affects their self-esteem, their mood, their anxiety, and they have behavior problems. So I think there's a whole application where, and if any of you know Gil Kleiman, we're doing forensic work with Gil. We talk about like writing that paper about how that's represented in children and their behavior. So I'm trying to condense a lot, but if Nancy, if you want that reference, I can give it to you because I think it really is a helpful topic. And it's an area we can intervene. But I think the intervention has to be not only child-based, it has to be family-based and community-based. To the question that was asked before, Varun, you know, in the South where they started to go into schools and talk about race, and now there's this backlash that you can't talk about diversity at all, and that's actually written into the law now in Georgia. I think the mistake they made was A, how you talk about it, and B, that you also need to have an intervention for parents. Like there are studies that show if you have an intervention with the parents and help the parents, as you have an intervention with the children, the families actually overall do better and people actually are able to move forward. But if you intervene with the child and you leave the parents and the family untouched, then you have a problem because you have a child who's talking about something not only that's upsetting, but a parent who can't manage it and you have a backlash. So there are ways we can socially look at this issue earlier in development that would be helpful for all of us.
Beverly, we have a couple more questions in the chat, in the Q&A. So I'd like to ask, oh, Gordon, did you disappear? Are you
You
here?
short answers, Jack?
Oh, here. Okay.
Yeah.
Gordon, what tell us, introduce yourself and tell everybody where you are.
Thank you.
Gordon.
Gordon Yanshishin. I'm in Toronto, part of the Canadian Psychoanalytic Association. Thanks again for your paper and your thoughtful discussion. This is very educational. As I said earlier, and on my unintentionally anonymous comment, as an older white male living in Canada, I really need to educate myself a lot about Black rage. So thank you. My question was about your reference to Vamek Volkan's important, I think, body of work. And as you cited one of his papers where he talks about cultural, racial groups having a chosen trauma. That's his expression. As part of something I think as analysts we don't know as much about, which is large group identity, something that to a greater or lesser extent we all have, as well as an individual identity. And that large group identity, my question was whether you could say more about Volkan's caution that that sense of a chosen trauma within a group, whether it's in America or Israel and Palestine or Ukraine and Russia, can overshadow or interfere with the ability to develop what you're describing, the compassion, the empathy for the other. I'm just wondering if you could say more about Volkan's concern that there's a kind of, and he uses it in a non-pejorative way, entitlement, or there can be an entitlement in any oppressed group. And yes, that's my question.
Thank you very much for your question, Gordon. And feel like I want to bring you in, although you introduce yourself as a white guy. So I had a patient during the pandemic. And there's a lot of studies on transracial adoptions, who the child is Black and was adopted by white identified parents. And in the course of all of this, when we were talking about how do you talk about race here, the father came to understand one day when I said to him, you know, we've been talking about this for a long time, but there's something I feel that is very hard for you. Can we kind of reflect on it together? And he was able to begin to think about his own personal history that came from, let's just say, to protect confidentiality, a country where his father had been an escapee from a genocide. And he realized that his family had handled it in a way that impacted his development. He had not realized it. So he saw himself as white, but as Jane Bowen says, you have to come into the suffering. And I think we can all come into the suffering if we recognize our own histories. But I think to add to your comment, though, you recognize the kind of not intended, but structurally constructed power differential when one is white identified in a study, in a history, in a country, or in a setting, which I respect and appreciate. And if we can have the conversation, we can talk about that together in a way that we respectfully, then that could get us to a better place. Now, you also raise a point, and this is what I think analysts need to do. We need to learn a lot more about large group identity, ethnic identity, and the course of development. We don't really teach that. I mean, when the APSA rewrote their standards in 2021, and I was asked to add parts on diversity, like I wrote in, like it has to be part of analytic training, both child analytic training and adult analytic training. We have an individual identity, and we're great on individual psyches, but we have a group identity that starts in middle childhood and evolves. And Vulcan talks a bit about how we develop an internal working model based on our group identity, in addition to our personal identity. And psychologists who've studied this talk about how we have both and who we are. And I don't think analysts know a whole lot about that. There is lots of information about racial identity of different groups and how they position themselves and how we position ourselves in groups. And in my paper, I reference his idea about a chosen trauma. Someone has to, Kristen, thank you. So one day I'll be able to answer the question. Every time I say chosen trauma, it like hits me, because one of the problems about, or one of the contributions, which I think maybe we can now understand with what's going on in the Middle East, is for Black Americans, the racial violence never ended. It's ongoing with police violence. So with an inflicted trauma isn't my chosen trauma, right? So I don't like that term. I prefer the term more of a group oppression trauma, right? And I think that's something we can all speak to. And the word entitlement, or Jack, I like your idea, hierarchy of suffering. So in the moment in the room, if I'm the marginalized person, I feel entitlement to the highest soapbox, right? Okay.
I call it the moral high ground.
I'm not going to go there. I'll call it the soapbox. I'd have to think about moral high ground. Maybe because it has too many connotations in the social world. I'd like hierarchy of suffering better.
Okay.
And how do we understand that? Okay, so the problem is, in those conversations, is that rarely does recognition given to that oppressive history that creates the feeling like I haven't been heard. In group conversations, how do we create that? The problem in the field of psychoanalysis is the field of psychoanalysis has to contend with its own history. You read Celia Brickman's book. Integrated into Freud is racist British anthropology about who the primitive other is. The history of psychoanalysis is white. heterosexist male. You know, we have to think about that and say, how does that actually represent itself in who we are and our theories and what we think first? What I think gets happened is the counter with, well, you're entitled, gets invoked before we actually sit with. So like, if we have groups, let's spend a class where each group gets to have the moral high ground, right? And say, how do we think about that? How do I sit back and listen to your history and hierarchy and your suffering? And then how do we bring together?
Hello?
She went away.
Oh my goodness. And Christine Gilbertson, could you mute yourself, please? Let me call her. Okay. Huh. Sorry about that. Okay, so you get okay. Beverly says she's coming back. She's going to try and sign back in. Okay, okay. Here she comes. Okay, we're admitting you. There's a tornado going on in Georgia, so yes,
Am I back?
yes.
So let's get off the phone here, Jack. So in work that's an extension of Vulcan and others who did diplomatic work, there has to be some recognition in the room of these issues if you're ever going to get to a conversation, right? I don't think we do a very good job at that. But we have to recognize that the world of analysis has been slanted for a long time. And if it, you know, I don't want to talk about this too much, because what's happening sort of with the Holmes Commission report is there's an argument with the data. And I'm open as a scientist. I was trained as a basic scientist before I became an analyst. I'm open to a discussion of data. But the argument can sometimes get away from just saying, what does that actually show? Why do this many people feel? For example, the data show that racial enactments in psychoanalytic institutes are pervasive. No one owns it. It happens everywhere. And institutes are not doing a very good job. But the one point that I wish people would quote more is that it harms everyone. That in the study, having done a lot of the interviews and helped develop the interview protocol, everyone said that this is really causing a problem in our community. Everyone said. So not finding a way to have a representative conversation harms the group. And my mind creates actually a moral void in the group if we don't speak to the harm that's being done. But I think in historical arguments, we have to find some way of giving recognition to the historical harms that are carried. Like our priest says, those histories are activated in us. Each of us has a sediment of our own history. There's some data from a colleague of mine who does yoga breathing, and Dick Brown, who's doing it in Rwanda and Ukraine to help traumatize people. I said, Dick, we gotta come up with a course where we do an hour of breathing to decrease the autonomic hyperarousal of everyone in the room. Because the moment you start talking about this, everyone's resting heart rate goes up. We need to calm everybody down and then talk. Because maybe we can talk without it going from 0 to 100. And I can talk about my trauma in a way that you'll hear, because then I can give you the soapbox. So that's my challenge is, how do we take turns on the soapbox? And then how do we share it cooperatively in a conversation? But what's getting activated in our society that I don't think we understand well, which is what my next paper is about, is the way attacking begins to happen. which is the negative representation of rage. When you trigger something in me that I need to attack and be destructive to you back, realize that's a representation of American society in a certain way, in that lynching meant you killed the Black person who was, in your mind, challenging you in some way, in your mind, harming you in some way. And I say in your mind because it's hard to argue that, given the social representation that laws prevented equality probably until the 1960s. That is encoded in our culture, that we attack the marginalized person and that it's okay to be destructive because I've defined you that way. And when we start to acknowledge that those patterns are transgenerationally transmitted and part of our psychic development, if you look at racial socialization data, if you look at neurobiological data, Black faces for white people activate the fear center in the amygdala. This is culturally represented. What if we tried to figure out how to interrupt those patterns so that we could talk about this in a way where those weren't activated? It would make it easier for us to sort of say, how do we look at our traumas? How are they passed transgenerationally? Like, I think personally, and I'm welcome to other positions in the group because I think we need to be welcome to each other, is that what's gone on October 7th is the reactivation of trauma.
Beverly,
Trauma that was not spoken about, at least in the analytic world, because Holocaust survivors didn't have that space yet. And now it's everyone's reactivated in the traumatic representation of our world. So Gordon, very complicated and important question. I hope you weren't hoping I'd have the answer.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I hope that we can learn, if we say that these things can be thought about in a helpful way, and if we learn more about developmentally how we got here, we're more open to the conversation of where we go with that.
We have officially 5 minutes left. We might, if Mariano's okay going over a few minutes because of our technological difficulties. We have one more question in the chat from Roman in the Q&A. Roman, do you want to ask your question? Show us your face. Tell us where you're from.
Yes, hello, good morning, Jack and Beverly. I can't be live on video, but I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we hear you.
Very good.
Where are you?
I am a licensed psychoanalyst in New York, but I live in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, and practice internationally.
Nice.
So very good to be joining you here. And the first thing I want to say is, you know, we're talking about rage and hatred and racism and trauma, but I feel so much love, Beverly, when you were speaking about these tremendously charged issues, emotionally charged issues. And what you've been saying also made me think of Bion, who had said, the color of skin saves us the trouble of going inside that skin. And of course, you use Bion, you invoke Bion in your paper. And so I just want to kind of think together with you about this. If I understand you to be saying that a Black person living in a racist society is inevitably a recipient of the projections, systemically racist at best, and white supremacists at worst, that are essentially unmetabolizable. In other words, if I understand you correctly, you are arguing that a Black person, or perhaps a person of color, is being constantly assaulted psychologically or even physically by the racist and violent beta elements. So that instead of being provided, let's say, a safe and understanding reverie type container, what one gets is a kind of psychotic container. And so one has no choice but to reject these toxic, unmetabolizable projections instead of identifying with them. So even though a Black person is bombarded by such projective identifications, we would say, they receive these projections but refuse to identify with them. for the sake, I think I read you to be saying, for the sake of their own sanity, emotional survival, and ultimately for the sake of eros, we could say. So then here's my question. Are you saying that Black rage results from the projective identification of rage that a person of color receives from the racist society, but chooses not to identify with, but nonetheless metabolizes it into a righteous human rage necessary for resistance, thus also using it in the service of eros? If that's the case, then isn't that a particular variation of an alpha function?
Did you read my next paper?
Oh,
Your question. And it's moving to me, first of all, how you started. I thank you so much. Because it causes me great sadness to see where we are. Last year, in 2023, I was positioned in the leadership of APSA in the middle of the controversy. I was the only person who was part of multiple groups. And it was the only time in my life where it made me sick, because I could feel the pain of multiple positions simultaneously in the controversy. That might be my blessing and my strength, that I actually can feel the other's pain. I always say I was raised as a Quaker, and I see a friend of mine in the audience who I know to be one too, and I won't say who she is, but she knows who she is. I was socialized to believe that anyone can be a Quaker if they just have a belief that there's a possibility of the goodness of God in each person. And I grew up in an area that was Jewish, so they're Jewish members of the Quaker meeting. So I grew up recognizing that when we can all be different, we can all share something beautiful, that the beauty of God and love could bring us together. That's what humanity should represent. I also had a father who was a civil rights activist who became a psychoanalyst, and the most powerful impact on my development was to watch him talk to racist people, which you could find on a daily basis. And I grew up in the constant assault in my development. But he did it with calm compassion. I never heard him yell, and we could clock it. Within 12 to 15 minutes, the person would be crying. He could find something in that person to get them to reflect on why they needed to carry a destructiveness as a result of that rage. So therein lies the question that I live with, that I write with, that I think about. How do we get there? And the reason why, to Gordon's question, I think it was Gordon, that it's so hard is because, as you talked about the Vita and beta elements, it's in the culture. It's not just individuals. It's a day. If the study shows that a Black teenager can have 5 discriminatory events per day, count a childhood up. It is very hard to get down from feeling that one has been assaulted in that. So first we have to recognize that what racism is a culturally imposed trauma, and that trauma impacts all of us differentially. And if we understand that, and the ways in which we are trained to either not recognize it or to recognize it or to live with it, and if we're trained how to look at identity across development, how we become, and then we can talk about being an analyst with people of different histories in the same room carrying their traumas. Then we will get to a psychoanalysis that moves us forward in the world. So
thank you, Beverly.
I thank you so much for your question and all the questions, because I was looking forward to hearing ideas from people from different parts of the world. And I'll just end with 30 seconds. Back during the pandemic, I was on an IPA panel, and one of my colleagues in Brazil, interestingly, had technological difficulties. And so she couldn't read her paper. And so she wanted one of us to read it, but she said, Beverly, I want you to read it. And as I was reading her paper about the history of racism in Brazil, and I told her this in it, I lost my marker of, was I talking about her in Brazil, or was I talking about me here? And I began to feel as if I was in her history. And I thought, therein lies. We can speak with love. And what I say in the Black Rage paper is, when there is a libidinal cathexis to moral injury that leads us to love, that means that the rage can be tempered and that civilization can become a true collective of humanity, as Freud ended in Civilization and Its Discontents. But we've got to get through a whole lot of rage that we understand and we carry and we metabolize and recognize in each other and ourselves along the way.
Thank you. Thank you. But I'd like, first of all, I'd like, for those of you with your cameras on, how about a round of applause for Dr. Stoute? I think she did a great job.
Thanks. I apologize for the technology problems.
No problem. You know, we're just amazed you got through a tornado watch. You know, that's fine. So thank you all for coming. Our next journal club will be in March, on Friday, March 8th, same time, 4 p.m. London time, 11 a.m. New York City time, Eastern time. And Danielle Knafel will be talking about her paper, Alone in a Crowded Mind, about how psychosis masks loneliness. So thank you all for coming, and